They say the West was one with iron and steam, with the bark of a colt and the turn of a card. But some stories, the real stories, were written in the dust, in the silence between heartbeats, and in the eyes of a child who had nothing left to lose. This is the story of a girl with no past, no kin, and not even a scrap of leather to cover her feet. She was a ghost on the prairie, a whisper in the tall grass. And then in a moment that would change the destiny of homesteaders and warriors alike, a Lakota chief, a man whose name was spoken with reverence and fear, did the unthinkable. He gave her his horse. And with that gift he gave her a name, a future and a chance for a reckoning that would stain the plains with blood and truth. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Dakota territory, beating down on the cracked earth until it shimmered with a heat that promised no life. It was a land of harsh truths and little forgiveness, a place where survival was a daily sacrament. For Evelyn Reed, it was in this crucible of heat and dust that she first saw the girl. A flicker of movement on the horizon, too small for a rider, too deliberate for a coyote. Evelyn shielded her eyes with a calloused hand, her calico dress clinging to her, with the damp insistence of the afternoon swelter. The figure staggered, a small, lonely speck against the immense, indifferent canvas of the plains. "Thomas!" she called, her voice carrying a note of urgency that cut through the thick air. "Rider coming!" Except as the figure drew nearer, Evelyn knew it was no rider. Thomas Reed emerged from the half-finished barn, the scent of fresh-cut pine and sweat clinging to him. He was a man carved from the same hard land. He worked his face a road map of sun and worry. He squinted, his gaze sharp and assessing. "That's no rider," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Too small, and on foot." On foot was a death sentence out here. The nearest town Redemption was a hard day's ride. The nearest anything was their homestead, a defiant square of tilled earth and raw timber in a sea of grass. They watched in silence as the child stumbled closer. It was a girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years of age, though it was hard to tell. Her hair was a matted tangle of sun-bleached straw, her face and limbs caked in a thick layer of grime. A simple tattered smock, once some indeterminate color, hung off her bony frame. But it was her feet that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. They were bare, a latticework of cuts, bruises, and angry blisters. Each step looked like an act of supreme will against a tide of agony. As she reached the edge of their tilled land, her strength finally gave out. She crumpled to the ground, not with a cry, but with a silent, exhausted surrender. Evelyn was moving before Thomas could say a word, her skirts kicking up dust as she ran. She knelt beside the small form, her heart aching at the sight. The girl's breathing was shallow, her lips cracked and pale. "Water, Thomas." Evelyn urged, her voice tight with a mixture of pity and command. "Quickly." She gently turned the child over. The girl's eyes fluttered open, wide and vacant, the color of a stormy sky. They held a terror so profound it seemed ancient, a horror that had burned away every trace of childhood. Then, just as quickly, they closed again. Thomas returned with the ladle from the water barrel, his movements stiff and reluctant. He watched as Evelyn gently cradled the girl's head, trying to coax a few drops between her parched lips. "We can't keep her, Evelyn," he said, his tone flat. "We don't know where she came from. Could be sickness. Could be trouble. And we can't leave her to die." Evelyn retorted, her focus entirely on the child. "Look at her. She's just a baby. She's a stranger. In these parts, strangers mean questions. Questions I don't have answers for. His gaze swept the horizon, a habitual check for threats. He was a man who believed in fences in clear lines between what was his and what was not. This girl was a complication he could not fence in. They carried her inside into the modest two-room sod house that was their entire world. The air inside was cooler, smelling of dried herbs and wood smoke. Evelyn laid the girl on their own bed, a luxury she hadn't intended to share, and began the slow, tender process of cleaning her. With each layer of grime, she washed away the more the child's fragility was revealed. Her ribs were stark beneath her skin, and a constellation of older, faded bruises mottled her back. The girl remained limp and unresponsive, lost in a world of her own. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even flinch as Evelyn cleaned her wounded feet. It was this profound, unnerving silence that worried Thomas the most. It wasn't natural. 2 days later, Deputy Marshal Wallace rode in. Wallace was a man who seemed perpetually annoyed by the sun, the dust, and the general state of the territory he was paid to police. He had a weasel-like face, with eyes that were always moving, always calculating. He sat astride a sweat-slicked bay, his badge a tarnished spot of authority on his dusty vest. "Reed," he said, dismounting without an invitation. "Heard you had a visitor." News, even without a wire, traveled fast on the prairie. "Just a lost child, Marshal," Evelyn said, stepping out of the house to meet him, positioning herself slightly in front of the door. "Dehydrated. We're tending to her." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "A child out here, alone." He peered past Evelyn, trying to get a look inside. "Any sign of her people? A burned wagon, maybe?" The question was pointed, weighted with the unspoken fear of an Indian raid. "Nothing," Thomas said, coming to stand beside his wife. "She just appeared. Can't talk. Or won't." Wallace stroked his chin, a gesture that seemed to amplify his smugness. "A mute orphan, and she just happens to wander onto your claim. Peculiar." He let his gaze drift over their land, lingering on the barn, the well, the neat rows of corn. "This is hard country, Reed. A man needs to be careful what he takes in. Stray dogs, stray kids. They can bring a whole mess of trouble." "We'll handle our own trouble, Wallace," Thomas said, his voice hard. "Is that so?" Wallace smirked. "Because I also heard Silas Croft has been asking about this parcel of land again. Says his survey maps show the aquifer runs right under your property, an aquifer that would be mighty valuable to a cattleman like him." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. A man with a new mouth to feed might find himself in a position where he needs to sell. Just something to consider. He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of any real respect, and swung himself back into the saddle. "You see any sign of her kin, you let me know, especially if they're the type that carry bows and arrows." As he rode away, leaving a plume of dust in his wake, Evelyn and Thomas exchanged a worried glance. The girl inside was more than just a lost child. She was a mystery, and in the unforgiving West, mysteries were often just another word for danger. That night, as a storm rumbled on the horizon, the girl finally made a sound. It wasn't a word, but a soft, whimpering cry in her sleep, a sound of such pure, unadulterated anguish that it made Evelyn's own eyes well with tears. She was a child, haunted by a memory. She couldn't voice a foundling who had brought not just herself, but the shadow of a powerful man, and the spectre of violence to their doorstep. Days bled into weeks. The girl remained a silent fixture in the Reed homestead, a ghost at their table. Evelyn, with a patience she didn't know she possessed, decided to call her Grace, a prayer for the mercy she had been shown, and the mercy Evelyn hoped to instill in her. Grace, however, seemed to not notice the name, or any name at all. She was a ship without a rudder adrift in a sea of silent trauma. Her silence was a wall thick and impenetrable. Evelyn would talk to her, narrating her daily chores, telling her stories from a childhood that seemed a world away from this harsh land. Grace would simply watch her stormy eyes, following Evelyn's movements, her expression unreadable. She ate what was given to her without complaint, her appetite slowly returning. She allowed Evelyn to braid her now clean hair and dress her in a spare dress of faded blue garment that hung loosely on her small frame. Thomas kept his distance. He saw Grace not as a child, but as an omen. He worked his land with a grim determination, his conversations with Evelyn clipped and practical. "Any words from her?" he'd ask each evening. The shake of Evelyn's head was always his answer. In his mind, the girl was a constant ticking reminder of Deputy Wallace's visit. Silas Croft was not a man to be trifled with. He was a cattle baron with a reputation as vast and ruthless as the herds he drove. His ambition was a force of nature, and the Reeds' small homestead was an inconvenient pebble in his path. Wallace was Croft's dog, and he had been sent to mark their territory. Yet despite the silence and the simmering tension, a small crack appeared in Grace's wall. It was the horses. The Reeds had two, a sturdy plough horse named Goliath, and a gentle mare, a palomino, named Sundance. It was Sundance who captured Grace's attention. The first time Grace ventured out of the sod house on her own, she walked directly to the corral. She didn't approach the fence, but stood a respectful distance away, her hands clasped behind her back. She just watched. For hours, she would stand there, a small, still figure, her gaze fixed on the mare. Sundance, in turn, seemed to notice her. The horse would often stop grazing and lift her head. Her ears pricked her soft brown eyes, looking directly at the girl. There was a quiet communion between them, a language that required no words. One hot afternoon, Evelyn watched from the window as Grace unlatched the corral gate, a task that required a surprising amount of dexterity for her small hands, and slipped inside. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. Sundance was gentle, but a horse was still a powerful, unpredictable animal. She started for the door, but Thomas's hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the scene. Grace walked slowly, deliberately toward the mare. She didn't reach out her hand. She simply stood near the horse's head and began to hum. It wasn't a melody, but a low, soothing sound, a drone that seemed to vibrate with the very air of the prairie. Sundance lowered her head, nudging the girl's shoulder gently, and let out a soft nicker. Grace finally lifted a hand and laid it on the mare's powerful neck, her fingers stroking the sun-warmed coat. A flicker of something not quite a smile, but a softening. A release of tension touched the girl's face. Thomas watched his expression, a mixture of awe and unease. "She's like a horse whisperer," he murmured. He had spent his life working with animals, breaking them to his will through strength and persistence. He had never seen anything like this. This silent, broken child possessed an innate understanding, a connection that defied logic. This small breakthrough emboldened Evelyn. She began giving Grace small chores involving the horses, fetching water, brushing Sundance's coat. The girl took to the tasks with a silent, solemn focus. The corral became her sanctuary, the one place where the ghosts that haunted her seemed to recede. The peace, however, was fragile. Deputy Wallace made good on his implied threat, returning a week later with an official-looking document. He found Thomas repairing a section of fence near the road. "Read," Wallace called, not bothering to dismount. He unfolded the paper with a flourish. "Got a notice here from the Territorial Land Office. It seems there's a discrepancy with your claim. The survey markers are ambiguous. My markers are exactly where the surveyor put them." Thomas stated, his grip tightening on his fence post digger. "According to Silas Croft's surveyor, they're off by a good 100 yards, which means your well and a good portion of your cornfield are technically on his property." Wallace smiled a thin, unpleasant line. "He's willing to be neighborly, of course. He'll overlook the trespassing, if you're willing to renegotiate the sale of this plot. His offer is generous, considering your clouded title." "This is my land," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous. "I filed the claim fair and square." "Claims can be challenged," Wallace said coolly, "especially when one party has the resources to hire lawyers and the other is trying to feed a stray." He glanced meaningfully toward the homestead where Grace was leading Sundance back to the corral. "Think it over, Reed. Croft's generosity has a deadline." That night, the tension in the sod house was thick enough to cut with a knife. "He's trying to steal our land." "Evelyn," Thomas said, pacing the small floor. "He's using that girl as leverage, just like I said he would." "He's using the land as leverage," Evelyn countered, her voice firm. "Grace has nothing to do with it. Croft wanted this place before she ever appeared. Don't you dare lay this at her feet. I see the way he looked at her. It's like he knows something we don't. There's a piece of this puzzle missing, and I have a bad feeling she's it." His words were prophetic. The next afternoon, as Grace was brushing Sundance in the corral, she suddenly froze. Her head snapped up, her gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. Her breath hitched, and the brush fell from her hand. A low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of pure terror. Evelyn and Thomas rushed outside. In the distance, silhouetted against the stark blue sky, was a small procession of riders. They were too far to make out details, but their profile was unmistakable. They weren't cowboys. The feathers in their hair, the lances they carried, were clear even from a mile away. It was a Lakota party. Thomas's face went pale. "Get in the house, Evelyn. Now!" He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door. But Grace didn't move. She remained rooted to the spot, her small body trembling uncontrollably. She stared at the approaching riders, and for the first time since she had arrived, her face was not vacant. It was filled with a raw, vivid memory. Her mouth opened, and a single agonized scream tore from her throat. "No!" The word was a strangled sob, a flash of lightning in the long, silent storm, and it confirmed Thomas Reed's deepest fear. His eyes met Evelyn's, and in them she saw a terrible, damning certainty. The girl wasn't just a foundling. She was a survivor, and her past was riding toward them on horseback. The approaching riders were not a war party. As they drew closer, their deliberate, unhurried pace became clear. There were 5 of them moving with the fluid grace of men who lived in the saddle. They were Lakota. Their dark hair braided their buckskin clothing, adorned with intricate beadwork. They were not seeking a fight. They seemed to be merely passing through, following an ancient path that predated any land claim or homesteader's fence. The man at their head rode with an air of quiet authority. He was older, his face a testament to a life lived under the sun and sky, etched with lines of wisdom and sorrow. A single magnificent black horn from a buffalo was tied into his hair, a symbol of his status. This was their leader. Inside the sod house, the air was thick with fear. Thomas stood by the window, his rifle held tight across his chest, its barrel angled toward the floor. Every instinct screamed at him to be ready. Stories of raids of burned-out homesteads and stolen children were the grim folklore of the frontier. Grace's scream had been like a lit match tossed into the tinderbox of his prejudice. "They're just passing," Evelyn whispered, though she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "Their path crosses the edge of our land. Passing parties don't make girls scream like that," Thomas countered, his jaw tight. "She saw them. She remembers." Grace was huddled by the hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth. The single word she had cried out had shattered her silence, only to be replaced by a series of shuddering, dry sobs. The terror in her was a palpable thing, a cold presence in the small room. But as Evelyn watched her, she noticed something strange. Grace wasn't looking out the window anymore. Her eyes were squeezed shut, as if the memory she was reliving was not on the prairie outside, but behind her own eyelids. Outside, the Lakota riders had stopped. They were 100 yards from the house, just beyond the flimsy wire fence that marked the Reeds' property line. They sat on their horses, patient and watchful, making no move to advance. The leader, the man with the black horn, raised a hand, palm open, in the universal sign of peace. Thomas didn't move his suspicion a hard knot in his gut. "It's a trick." "Thomas, for heaven's sake," Evelyn pleaded. "They haven't done anything. Put the rifle down before you start something that can't be stopped." The standoff stretched into a tense silence, broken only by the buzz of insects and the soft sigh of the wind. The leader dismounted his movements, unhurried and deliberate. He handed the reins of his horse, a powerful, deep-chested war pony, to a younger warrior beside him, and took a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of the fence. He stood there, his gaze fixed on the house, his expression impassive but not hostile. It was the younger warrior who broke the strange tableau. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the homestead. They passed over the barn, the well, the house, and then settled on the corral, specifically on a small object lying in the dust where Grace had dropped it, the horse brush. But that wasn't what held his attention. Tied to the leather strap of the brush was a small, almost insignificant trinket Grace had added herself, a tiny leather pouch no bigger than her thumb, decorated with a unique pattern of blue and white beads. It was the one object she'd had with her when they found her clutched so tightly in her fist that Evelyn had to gently pry her fingers open. The young warrior's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He leaned over and spoke rapidly in his own tongue to the chief, his voice low and urgent, pointing a finger not at the house, but at the corral. The chief's gaze followed. He looked at the brush, at the tiny beaded pouch. His stoic demeanor shifted. A look of profound surprise, then of deep contemplative thought crossed his face. He looked back at the house, but his gaze was different now. It was no longer the generic assessment of a settler's dwelling. It was sharp, focused searching. He spoke a few words to his men, then turned and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the front door of the sod house. He was unarmed, his hands held open at his sides. Thomas's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. "He's coming." "Don't you raise that gun, Thomas Reed," Evelyn warned, her voice trembling but firm. "You hear me? He's alone, and he's unarmed. You will show him the respect of a neighbor." The chief stopped 10 feet from the door. He didn't speak, but simply stood there, waiting. His presence was immense, a silent challenge to the fear and suspicion that radiated from the house. It was Evelyn who opened the door. She stepped outside, her heart pounding against her ribs, and faced the Lakota leader. She offered a hesitant nod. "Can I help you?" She asked the words, feeling small and inadequate. The chief's eyes were dark and intelligent. They looked at her, then passed her into the dim interior of the house, where Grace was still huddled, still lost in her waking nightmare. He said nothing, but his gaze was a question. The young warrior, whom Evelyn now saw, had a fierce, proud face, marked by a thin scar on his cheek, walked to the fence line. He pointed at the brush in the corral. "Wichapi owingza," he said, his voice clear and strong. He then pointed to the small pouch. "That. Where did you get it?" His English was halting but understandable. Evelyn was confused. The pouch. The girl. Grace. She had it with her when we found her. The young warrior translated for his chief. The older man listened intently, his eyes never leaving the interior of the house. A look of dawning, sorrowful understanding settled on his features. He spoke in his own language, his voice a deep, resonant baritone. The young warrior translated. "He is Chief Blackhorn. He says the beaded pattern on that pouch was made by the women of his own family. It is a star pattern for a child born under the morning star." A cold dread mingled with a bewildering sense of confusion washed over Evelyn. This wasn't making any sense. If the girl was connected to them, why would she scream in terror? As if hearing her unspoken question, Grace suddenly went still. Her rocking stopped, slowly, shakily. She lifted her head. Her tear-streaked face was a mask of confusion. The chief's voice, though speaking a language she shouldn't have known, seemed to have reached her, to have pierced the veil of her trauma. She pushed herself to her feet, and like a sleepwalker moved toward the open door. Thomas tensed, but Evelyn put a restraining hand on his arm. Grace stepped out into the blinding sunlight, blinking. She saw the chief, and she froze. But the terror that had racked her moments before was gone. In its place was a look of dawning, fragmented recognition. She looked at the chief's face, at the black horn in his hair, at the lines around his eyes. Then her gaze drifted past him to the warrior holding the reins of the chief's horse. She saw the warrior, then the horse itself, and it was the horse that broke the dam. Her flashback was not of these men attacking her. The chaotic images that flooded her mind were of fire, of shouting, of men with painted faces. But the paint was crude wrong. The faces beneath the paint were pale. They were white men, disguised. They were surrounding a burning wagon, her mother screaming her name, her father fighting back before falling to the ground. And then she remembered another face, a Lakota face, young and fierce, the same warrior who now stood before her, pulling her from the flames, hiding her in the tall grass, whispering to her to stay silent before he was forced to flee by the sheer number of attackers. Her memory was a lie, a child's fractured interpretation of a horrific event. She hadn't been screaming at the sight of the Lakota. She had been screaming at the memory of the fire, a memory their appearance had unlocked. She looked at the young warrior, her eyes wide with this new cataclysmic understanding. "Lone Wolf," she whispered the name coming to her, as if from a dream. The young warrior Lone Wolf flinched as if struck. His jaw dropped, and he stared at the girl in disbelief. Chief Blackhorn heard the whispered name. He took a step closer, his eyes gentle now, filled with a profound sadness. He looked at the small, traumatized child before him. "Wiyaka," the chief said, his voice soft as a prayer. "Little feather." The name settled over the girl, a warm blanket on a cold night. It was her name. the name her mother had given her. And with the return of her name, the wall of her silence finally, irrevocably crumbled. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, the rifle suddenly feeling heavy and foolish in his hands. Evelyn's mind reeled, trying to piece together the fragments of this impossible revelation. Lone Wolf. The fierce young warrior looked at the girl at Wiyaka with an expression of utter astonishment, as if seeing a ghost from a battle he thought long lost. It was Chief Black Horn who anchored the scene, his presence a center of calm in the swirling vortex of confusion. He spoke again in the deep, resonant tones of the Lakota language, his words directed at Lone Wolf, but intended for all. Lone Wolf, still struggling to process the miracle before him, began to translate. His voice was thick with emotion. He says he remembers now, a year ago. A trader named Cormac, a white man who spoke their tongue and traded fairly. He had a Lakota wife from our band. They called her She Who Sings. They had a daughter, Wiyaka. He looked at the girl whose face was now streaked with fresh tears, not of terror, but of a grief so deep it had been buried alive. Cormac had found something. Lone Wolf continued, his gaze turning hard as he looked out across the Reed's property. He told the chief he found the yellow metal. Gold. Not a big strike, but enough. It was on this land. He was on his way to redemption, to file a formal claim, one that would be recognized by the white man's law. His wife and child were with him. Thomas felt a chill go down his spine that had nothing to do with the day's heat. He thought of Wallace of Silas Croft's relentless, inexplicable desire for this specific, unremarkable plot of land. "We found the smoke," Lone Wolf said, his voice dropping low, his eyes haunted by the memory. "We were too late. A war party, it looked like. But it was wrong. The markings on their faces were not ours. Their war cries were clumsy, false." He clenched his jaw. "They were white men, dressed as us. We fought them. They were many. In the chaos, I saw Wiyaka's mother fall. She pushed her daughter toward me. I got the child away from the wagon, hid her in the grass. But more of them came. We were outnumbered and had to retreat. We thought the girl was lost, taken or killed." The entire sordid picture snapped into focus with brutal clarity. A false flag attack, a land grab orchestrated with a level of cruelty that was hard to comprehend. Croft hadn't just wanted the land, he had murdered for it, and had tried to start an Indian war to cover his tracks. Silas Croft. Evelyn breathed the name, her voice filled with revulsion. And Deputy Wallace. Wiyaka, hearing the name Cormac, let out a small sob. "Papa?" She whispered the word, a fresh wound. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes pleading for an anchor in this storm of memory. Evelyn moved to her, wrapping her arms around the trembling child, holding her tight. Thomas slowly, deliberately leaned his rifle against the exterior wall of the house. He walked forward until he stood beside his wife, placing a hand on Wiyaka's shoulder. The gesture was one of protection, of solidarity. The lines of suspicion had been erased from his face, replaced by a cold, righteous anger. He was no longer a man afraid of a stranger. He was a man staring into the face of true evil. Chief Black Horn watched this silent tableau, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the woman's comfort, the man's newfound resolve. He saw the truth that had finally been unearthed. He walked to the fence line, his gaze taking in the small homestead, the struggling corn, the humble sodded house. This was the land that had cost Wiyaka everything. He spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of a leader's decree. He says the girl's father, Cormac, was an honest man. Lone Wolf translated. He was a friend. The claim he was going to file predates yours, and it predates the lies of the cattle baron. By the white man's law, and by the justice of the earth, this land belongs to her. To Wiyaka. The chief then turned and walked back to his men. He spoke to Tha, and there was a murmur of assent of respect for his decision. He went directly to his own horse, the magnificent war pony that had carried him with such pride. It was a fine animal, a jet-black stallion with intelligent eyes and muscles that coiled with power. He took the reins from the warrior who held them and led the horse back toward the fence. He stopped before Wiyaka. The girl, still sheltered by the reeds, looked up at the imposing chief and his powerful horse, her eyes wide. Chief Black Horn looked not at the adults, but directly at the child. He spoke to her in Lakota, his voice gentle now like a father speaking to his daughter. Lone Wolf, his voice now filled with awe, struggled to find the English words. He says, a Lakota child of his band does not walk. A child of a warrior does not have to hide. She is Wiyaka, daughter of She Who Sings, and Cormac the Honest. She has a name, she has a family, and she will have a horse. With a grace that belied his age, Chief Black Horn passed the leather reins over the fence and held them out to the small girl. He gives her his horse, Lone Wolf whispered unnecessarily. He gives her Matto, the bear, his own mount. It is a gift of honor, a sign that she is not forgotten, that she is one of us, and a sign to all others that she is protected by the Lakota. The gesture was breathtaking in its significance. It was more than a gift of property. It was a statement. It was a bridge between two worlds, forged in tragedy, but offered in hope. It was a direct challenge to men like Croft and Wallace. Wiyaka, her small hands trembling, reached out and took the reins. The powerful stallion Matto lowered his head and nudged her hand, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. For the first time, a true, genuine smile touched Wiyaka's lips. It was a sliver of sunlight after a long, brutal storm. She had arrived with nothing, a nameless ghost on the plains. Now she stood with a family at her back, her true name on her lips, and the reins of a chief's horse in her hands. Chief Black Horn gave a final, solemn nod to the reeds. He and his men mounted their other horses, and without a backward glance rode away, their forms receding into the vastness of the prairie from which they came. They left behind a stunned silence, a magnificent black stallion, and the looming certainty of a violent confrontation. The truth was out, and in the Wild West, the truth was often paid for in lead. The gift of the horse changed everything. Matto the black stallion was not just an animal. He was a symbol. His presence in the reeds' corral was a silent, powerful declaration. He was a living testament to Wiyaka's story, a direct link to Chief Black Horn, and a stark warning to anyone who wished the girl or her past to remain buried. The fragile peace of the homestead was shattered, replaced by the humming tension of a storm about to break. Thomas Reed was a changed man. The suspicion and fear had been burned out of him, replaced by a hard, protective fury. He now looked at Wiyaka not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. He spent the next day fortifying the homestead, checking the action on his rifle, and keeping a constant watchful eye on the horizon. He spoke little, but his movements were filled with a grim purpose that Evelyn had never seen before. Wiyaka, for her part, blossomed. With her name and her memories restored, painful though they were, a light had returned to her eyes. She spent every possible moment with Matto, grooming his sleek black coat, whispering to him, in a mixture of broken English and the Lakota words that were slowly returning to her. The horse was her anchor to her past and her hope for the future. She rode him with an innate skill that left Thomas speechless, a small, determined figure on a powerful steed, as if she had been born in the saddle. The reckoning came 2 days after the chief's visit. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood when 2 riders appeared. It was Deputy Marshal Wallace, and beside him a large, imposing man on a fine grey gelding. The man had a florid face, a thick neck that strained against his collar, and the cold, arrogant eyes of someone for whom power was a birthright. It could only be Silas Croft. They weren't coming for a conversation. 3 other men, rough-looking ranch hands with rifles resting across their saddles, fanned out behind them. "Evelyn, get Wiyaka in the root cellar." Thomas ordered, his voice dangerously calm. He took his rifle from the wall. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "Thomas, no," Evelyn pleaded, her face pale with dread. "Do it, Evelyn," he insisted, his eyes hard. "This has to end, one way or another." Wiyaka, who had been in the corral with Matto, saw the riders. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her, but it was different now. It was mixed with anger. These were the men, or men like them, who had stolen her life. She looked from the riders to the determined set of Thomas's jaw. She understood. Evelyn grabbed her hand. "Come on, sweet girl. We have to hide." But as Evelyn pulled her toward the heavy wooden door of the cellar, Wiyaka pulled back. Her eyes were locked on Matto. An idea, wild and desperate, sparked in her mind. Outside, Croft and his men reined in just beyond shouting distance. "Read!" Croft's voice boomed across the prairie, thick with impatience. "Your time is up. I have a court order here, signed by the marshal declaring your claim invalid. You will vacate the premises immediately." "This is my land," Thomas shouted back, standing his ground in front of the house. "And you're a murderer, Croft." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and deadly. Wallace flinched. Croft, however, merely laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Brave words from a dirt scratcher with a single rifle." Croft sneered. He turned to Wallace. "Marshal, this man is making threats against a citizen and refusing to comply with a legal order. You're authorized to use whatever force is necessary." Wallace drew his pistol, his hand trembling slightly. "Don't be a fool, Reed. Just walk away." It was then that they saw him. A lone rider, sitting motionless on a ridge a 1/4 mile to the east. It was Lone Wolf. He had not gone far. He had been watching, waiting, honoring the chief's unspoken command to see this through. His presence was a silent question mark, an unknown factor that made Croft's men shift uneasily in their saddles. Croft's face darkened with rage. "One Indian isn't going to save you. Take him!" he roared at his men. The first shot was not from Croft's men, nor from Thomas. It was the sharp crack of a rifle from the ridge. Lone Wolf was a superb marksman. The bullet didn't hit anyone. It kicked up a puff of dust just in front of Wallace's horse, causing the animal to rear in panic. That was all the signal Thomas needed. He raised his rifle and fired the shot, aimed at one of the ranch hands. The man cried out and clutched his shoulder, his own rifle clattering to the ground. The world erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. Thomas ducked behind the corner of the sod house, the thick walls providing meager but essential cover. He reloaded his movements, practiced and sure. Croft and his men dismounted, using their horses for cover as they returned fire bullets, thudding into the timber of the barn and chipping at the sod bricks of the house. Inside, Evelyn held her breath, her hands clasped to her mouth. But Wiyaka was gone. She had slipped away in the chaos, her mind fixed on her desperate plan. She ran hunched low to the back of the corral. Gunfire ripped through the air around her. With trembling fingers, she unlatched the gate, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Mato, agitated by the noise, but trusting the girl, allowed her to swing herself onto his bare back. She grabbed a fistful of his mane, her small legs clinging tightly to his sides. She remembered the stories her father told her, stories of Lakota warriors and their brilliant tactics. Diversion, confusion. "Here!" She screamed the Lakota command for go, erupting from her lungs. She kicked her heels into Mato's flanks. The great black stallion surged forward. But Wiyaka didn't ride toward the fight. She wheeled Mato around and galloped straight for the other horses. With a wild cry, she rode along the line of Croft's and Wallace's tethered mounts, waving her arms and shouting. Her sudden appearance, a child on a chief's war horse charging out of the chaos, was so unexpected, so utterly audacious, that for a moment the men stopped firing. The panicked horses, already spooked by the gunfire, went wild. They reared, broke their reins, and scattered across the prairie in a frenzy of terror, taking with them the men's spare ammunition and their only means of escape. The diversion was perfect. In that moment of shocked hesitation, Lone Wolf fired again from the ridge, his shot taking another of Croft's men in the leg. Thomas seized the opportunity, leaning out from his cover to get a clear shot. His bullet struck Deputy Marshal Wallace in the arm, sending his pistol flying. Wallace screamed and crumpled to the ground, clutching the wound. Silas Croft, his face purple with rage, saw his advantage evaporating. His men were wounded, his horses gone. He was left with only one target for his fury. He saw Wiyaka wheeling the black stallion around, a look of fierce triumph on her face. "You!" he snarled, raising his rifle. He took aim at the child. "No!" Thomas bellowed. He broke cover, firing his last shot. The bullet struck Croft in the chest. The cattle baron staggered, a look of disbelief on his face. He fired one last wild shot that went wide, then collapsed into the dust, his reign of terror finally over. The remaining two ranch hands, seeing their boss fall and the fight lost, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Silence descended heavy and ringing. The smell of gunpowder hung thick in the air. Lone Wolf rode down from the ridge, his rifle held ready, his face grim. Evelyn rushed out of the house, her eyes scanning the scene wildly, until they landed on Wiyaka safe, atop the magnificent black horse. Thomas leaned heavily against the wall of the house, a dark stain spreading across his side. He had been hit by Croft's final desperate shot. He slid to the ground, his face pale, but his eyes were on Wiyaka, and in them there was no regret, only a fierce, profound pride. The reckoning was complete. The aftermath of the gunfight was a quiet, somber affair. Lone Wolf, his face a mask of grim efficiency, helped Evelyn bind Thomas's wound. The bullet had passed clean through the flesh of his side, a painful but not a mortal injury. The two captured ranch hands, their bluster gone, were tied up alongside the whimpering Deputy Marshal Wallace. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the plains, Lone Wolf built a fire. He shared his own meager rations with Evelyn and Wiyaka, a silent offering of respect. The cultural chasm between the homesteader's wife and the Lakota warrior seemed to vanish in the shared relief and exhaustion of the battle's end. Wallace, cradling his wounded arm, was the first to break. Faced with the stoic warrior and the righteous anger in Evelyn's eyes, his cynical bravado crumbled, leaving behind a pathetic, frightened man. He confessed everything. He told them how Croft had discovered the old survey map, showing the potential for gold, how he had hired men to disguise themselves as Lakota to murder Cormac and his family, planning to blame the natives and scare off any other settlers. He admitted that Croft had him on the payroll for years, using him to manipulate land claims and intimidate homesteaders. Wiyaka, sitting by the fire, listened to the confirmation of her darkest memories, her small hand resting on Matto's neck as the stallion stood protectively beside her. The next morning, Lone Wolf rode to the nearest army outpost, not to Redemption, where Wallace's influence might still hold sway. He returned 2 days later with a troop of cavalry led by a young, clear-eyed captain who listened intently to the story from Evelyn Thomas and a now talkative Wallace. The captain looked at the signed confession, at the magnificent black horse given to a small girl, and at the determined faces of the Reed family. He saw the truth. The official investigation confirmed everything. The 2 ranch hands corroborated Wallace's story. Silas Croft's empire, built on lies and blood, crumbled into dust. His name became a curse on the plains. Wallace was taken away in irons destined for a federal prison. The territorial court, in a rare moment of true justice, posthumously honored Cormac's original claim, and in an even rarer act they allowed that claim to be transferred not to the state, but to his sole surviving heir, his daughter Wiyaka. The Reed's homestead was now officially hers, but it was clear to everyone that it belonged to all of them. News of the events at the Reed homestead traveled fast, becoming something of a legend. It was the story of the mute orphan who had brought down a tyrant, of the stern homesteader who had fought alongside a Lakota warrior to protect her, and of the great Chief Black Horn, whose gift of a horse had been an act of profound faith and a catalyst for justice. It didn't magically erase the deep-seated tensions between the settlers and the native tribes, but it became a single point of light in the darkness, a story told around campfires by both white and Lakota people, as a reminder that honor and courage could sometimes bridge the deepest divides. Life for the Reeds and for Wiyaka found a new rhythm. Thomas recovered his wound, leaving a scar that he bore with pride. The hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a gentle warmth, especially when he looked at Wiyaka. He and Evelyn formally adopted the girl, not to erase her past, but to embrace it. They called her Wiyaka Reed, a name that honored both the family she had lost and the family she had found. She was no longer the silent, dust-choked foundling. She was a girl of 2 worlds, fluent in the language of the homestead and the whispers of the Lakota tongue that Lone Wolf, a frequent and welcome visitor, helped her relearn. She was a girl with a family, a future, and a magnificent black horse that was her constant companion. On clear evenings, Wiyaka would ride Matto to the highest point on her land. She would look out across the vast, endless sea of grass, the same plains that had once taken everything from her. She was no longer afraid. She had no fine shoes, preferring the feel of the earth beneath her bare feet. She had no need for them. She was Wiyaka. She had a family. And she had a horse given to her by a chief, a living symbol of a new dawn, rising over the wild, unforgiving, but ultimately beautiful western plains. In the end, the story of Wiyaka Reed isn't just about survival. It's a testament to the fact that family isn't always about the blood you share, but the blood you're willing to spill for one another. It's a story that proves that even in the harshest of lands, torn by greed and prejudice, A single act of kindness, the gift of a horse from a chief to an orphan, can be enough to sow the seeds of justice. Wiyaka's journey from a nameless, shoeless ghost to a proud landowner and a bridge between two cultures reminds us that our true worth is never defined by what we've lost, but by the courage we find to reclaim our name and fight for our future. If this story of the untamed West of unexpected heroes and unbreakable bonds moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of true grit, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of history. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.